Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.
This video was inspired by part 13 of the Rational Response debate featuring Kirk Cameron and Ray Comfort. The floor has been open to questions, and one lady asks,
You gave us an example of the perfection of creation and therefore the existence of God, your eyes, your nose, your mouth. Then how do you explain cancer?
There's some debate as to whether or not Ray is trying to dodge the question by diverting the issue from cancer to suffering in general. But in any case, he responds,
Firstly, I've never used the word perfection of creation. It's very important to understand that the Bible says we live in a fallen creation.
Unsatisfied, the lady in the audience continues,
We are supposed to believe that the Lord created this perfect machine. Now, this perfect machine often goes very wrong.
And Ray offers pretty much the same argument.
The Bible tells us we live in a fallen creation. In the beginning, God created everything perfect. No disease, no cancer, no suffering, no death. As by the sin of one man, or death entered the world, death passed on all men, the Bible says, because all have sinned.
I think the problem here is that the lady in the audience is looking for a scientific answer, whereas Ray is offering a philosophical one. But I think we could have guessed that science wasn't on Ray and Kirk's agenda based upon the way they introduced themselves.
Hi, I'm Kirk Cameron, and my partner Ray Comfort and I come to you tonight not as molecular biologists or as rocket scientists, but simply as an author and an actor, and we want to do two things that fly in the face of convention. One, we'd like to show you that the existence of God can be proven 100% absolutely without the...
What good a rocket scientist would be in an evolutionary debate, I don't know. But onwards and downwards. So I thought I'd offer my 2 pence on the subject, from a scientific standpoint of course. And the answer that I've come to, in response to the question, did God create cancer, based upon a fairly basic understanding of anatomy, cell biology and chemistry, is a resounding probably. I'm not saying that Adam and Eve themselves died of cancer, although something had to kill them and Adam lived to 930, so the odds don't look bad. The point I want to make is that the term perfection is very easy to bandy about, but in reality perfection is a very rare thing. And what I want to prove here is that even God's best design wasn't perfect, and the door is still left open for the possibility of cancer. And before we start, I want to lay out some assumptions. No, not that kind of assumption. I mean the kind of assumptions that creationists pick holes in to argue against things like radiometric dating. However, I think mine are going to be slightly harder to argue with. Assumption 1. Human anatomy and biochemistry in Eden was not radically different to what it is today. By this I mean that Adam and Eve had all the same internal organs as modern-day humans, and that all their cellular processes were more or less identical. If they didn't have a particular body system, it does beg the question where it came from in the time between then and now. It may even be a very good case for evolution. Assumption 2. Chemistry in Eden was not radically different to today, by which I mean that chemicals reacted in exactly the same way as they do today. They didn't have ideas of their own, there were no forces governing what they did and didn't do. In other words, chemistry is chemistry is chemistry. I think you'd be hard-pushed to find a biblical quotation which argues with these points. Where does it say that when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, God suddenly decided to shake up their anatomy and the chemistry which powers them? But I may be wrong. So let's start with something on which we all agree. Cancer is caused by genetic mutations. Unless you're this nut job who thinks it's a fungus. So considering that Eden is supposed to be a perfect place, we can eliminate 3 groups of cancer-causing agents. We can eliminate cancer-causing radiation. We can eliminate chemical mutagens, and we can eliminate things like the papillomaviruses which can also cause cancer. So even though we know it's bollocks, let's use Kent Hovind's imaginary ice shield to block all the UV and X-ray radiation. Let's gather together all the radioactive elements and put them somewhere on the other side of the world well out of harm's way, although that would be a pretty hellish place. Let's put all the chemical mutagens in the Staten Island landfill site, and let's lock away all the viruses in some kind of Pandora's box to be opened at a later date. So it says in Genesis that Adam and Eve may eat. The principal reason why animals eat is for energy. And if you didn't need energy, then eating would seem like a bit of a waste of time. So it's fair to assume that Adam and Eve did eat. Or we can also assume that Adam and Eve's cells didn't produce reactive oxygen species which damage DNA. The problem comes that when we eat, we take on nutrients such as sodium, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, etc. And these become assimilated into our body. In order to prevent them reaching toxic levels, we have to excrete them again. In modern-day humans, this comes from the breakdown products of cells which have become worn out. So let's assume that the same thing happened in Adam and Eve. Cells would have died off and would have been replaced with new ones by the usual means of cell proliferation, or mitosis. However, even if you don't believe that any of Adam and Eve's cells would have died, and that everything was perfectly recycled, by using assumption 1 and the fact that Adam and Eve must have had blood, we know that their cells would have divided and multiplied. Let's ignore the white blood cells and concentrate just on the red blood cells which carry oxygen. New blood cells are made at the rate of about 1.4 million every second, and are broken down in the spleen at roughly a similar rate. They're broken down because the proteins of which they are made degrade over time, and this is a process that happens chemically in aqueous environments, regardless of any other factors. So Adam and Eve would have needed to replace their blood cells, which means that cell proliferation must have taken place. Cell proliferation involves DNA replication. And this is where it gets really interesting, because DNA mutates without the need for ionizing radiation, chemical mutagens, or viruses. 3 of the bases of DNA contain ketone groups. Almost all molecules that contain keto groups undergo a process called enolization. This happens spontaneously in aqueous environments, such as the environment of the cell. In double-stranded DNA, the pairing of the DNA prevents them from enolizing, but during the rather sensitive stage at which the DNA is separated into single strands, the bases are exposed and can then undergo enolization. Here's what guanine looks like when it converts from the keto form to the enol form, and when it does so, it no longer pairs with cytosine, but can pair with thymine. A similar process also occurs with thymine and adenine. The process is rare, but it does happen. Cells cannot communicate with each other to ask which is the correct copy, so there's no way that they can correct this mistake. So when the cell divides again, a lasting change is made to the genome, a mutation. All it takes is for enough mutations to occur in cancer-related genes, and you end up with a malignant tumour. So there you go. If you think there's something I've missed, then please let me know. But what I hope I've proven is that even God's most perfect attempt at design has turned out to be flawed. Oh well, back to the drawing board, I guess.